Avoidance appears strong, calculated, even admirable to the untrained eye. Someone pulls away, stays silent, offers no reaction, and it feels like power. It feels like they're above it all, but that's the illusion. What seems composed is often just concealed chaos. When an avoidant disconnects, it's not dominance, it's defense. It's not maturity, it's retreat. Their silence isn't clarity, it's confusion disguised. They're not ahead of the moment, they're escaping it. Emotional evasion isn't a badge of confidence. It's a blanket woven with fear. They back away not because they've mastered detachment, but because they never learned regulation. When intensity rises, whether in love, confrontation, or closeness, they vanish behind space. That vanishing act is their security blanket. It's not strength keeping them still, it's the inability to handle vulnerability. The less they engage, the less they risk. That is their equation. To feel less, they invest less. To stay safe, they stay distant. They don't process, they postpone. They don't solve, they stall. They don't soothe, they suppress. And all of it is choreographed to feel untouchable. If they can't control the environment, they'll try to control themselves. But not in the way you think. They'll control visibility. They'll restrict access. They'll hide, not heal. They'll retreat, not reflect. And that works for a while. It works as long as their absence feels meaningful to you. It works as long as you respond to it. It works until you don't. That's the turning point. When you stop reacting to their emotional distance, something shifts not in you but in them. That moment when they no longer feel in control of the emotional climate, panic sets in. Quiet panic. Subtle panic. A shift behind the eyes, a stutter in the silence, a crack in the composure. The armor doesn't clang to the ground, but it starts to rust. The control they thought they had, gone. Not because you took it, because you stopped handing it over. Their stillness only ever had power if you were moving toward it. The absence only stung if you kept craving presence. When your validation no longer hinges on their availability. When your worth isn't wrapped in their attention, the mask slips. Slowly. Sloppily, soft edges begin to appear where there was once precision. The cold gets clumsy. The disappearance looks more like disorientation. Because now it's not working. You're not chasing. You're not questioning. You're not collapsing. They thought silence would steer you. They assumed space would scare you. They relied on withdrawal to win the argument they never spoke aloud. But none of it functions when you choose groundedness. Stillness used to shake you. Now it centers you. That reversal confuses them, because for them stillness wasn't presence, it was punishment. If you didn't feel hurt by the silence, how would they maintain control? If you didn't react, how would they redirect the conversation without speaking? Avoidance is rehearsed. It's been learned through repetition, reinforced by outcomes. Every time they withdrew and were pursued, the lesson deepened. Every time they shut down and were soothed, the wiring strengthened. It became a formula. If discomfort, then distance. If closeness, then control. If pressure, then protect. These weren't conscious choices, they were patterns. Deep, durable, difficult to break reflexes. Not designed to harm, but designed to preserve. But that preservation had a cost. It wasn't just others left out, it was them too. They stopped experiencing true connection, because every time it got real, they retreated. Every time someone got close, they flinched. Every moment that could have built intimacy became a moment where fear ran the show. They've become architects of detachment. Builders of walls. Painters of false peace. They value the appearance of calm more than the substance of healing. But inside, there's noise. Not volume, but tension. Inner tug-of-wars. A longing to feel safe that battles the fear of being seen. The mask isn't just worn for others. It's worn for themselves. Because if they admitted the avoidance wasn't power, what would it be? They'd have to face the reality that it's a shield, not a sword. They'd see that control was a myth, that silence wasn't strategy, it was symptom. That by evading discomfort, they nurtured dysfunction. But that awareness only comes when the old strategies stop working. When someone, maybe you, no longer feeds the cycle. You've broken a rhythm they've danced in for years. You didn't fight their silence with louder words. You didn't fill the void with desperate gestures. You didn't beg for return. You sat in your own presence. You built resilience without resentment. You chose boundaries over bargaining. You didn't abandon them. You just stopped abandoning yourself. And that changed the equation. They expected chaos. You delivered calm. They forecasted chase. You gave distance. They braced for drama. You responded with dignity. Now they're left with their own echo. No reactions to orbit. No confusion to manipulate. No imbalance to lean on. They're seeing themselves in a mirror of your clay. And that reflection, it's unfamiliar. It reveals what was once hidden. That avoidance doesn't lead, it hides. It doesn't resolve, it rereads us. It doesn't protect relationships, it prolongs pain. They thought withdrawal made them strong. But now, standing still beside your silence, they feel something they never prepared for: vulnerability. Not the vulnerability that comes from being attacked. The kind that comes from being unmasked. When no one chases, their steps feel exposed. When no one fills the silence, their own becomes deafening. They feel the absence of chaos, and it unsettles them. Because they've mistaken peace for danger and detachment for discipline. They're meeting a new reality, one where control isn't given freely. Where calm isn't submission, it's sovereignty. Where space doesn't mean power, it means pause. And for them, pause is terrifying. Avoidance survive by scripting. Predictable moves. Familiar maneuvers. They don't thrive in unpredictability. When your reaction becomes unreadable, when you don't fold into their pattern, they don't know how to adjust. Control depended on you playing your part. When you stop participating, they lose the script. That loss feels like instability, but it's really just unfamiliar freedom. The freedom for you to finally hold emotional ground. The freedom to no longer shrink when they disappear. The freedom to no longer decode every silence. You're not cold, you're not cruel, you're clear. That's the difference. You're not abandoning connection, you're refusing confusion. You're not punishing them, you're protecting peace. And while they might flinch at that clarity, it's exactly what exposes the truth that avoidance is armor, not authority. And when it stops shielding them from discomfort, it starts suffocating. The mask doesn't shatter with noise, it unravels in stillness. And that unraveling, it's the beginning of everything honest. The unraveling begins in silence, but the true shift occurs when you remain composed through it, not shaken, not provoked, just balanced. The kind of stillness that doesn't freeze, it liberates. Your steadiness is not a void to be filled, it's a message. Every breath you take without chasing, every choice not fueled by desperation, chips away at their assumed dominance. Because what rattles someone used to emotional leverage is not aggression, it's neutrality. They're watching, observing, waiting for the usual outcome: the message you'd send, the over-explaining you'd offer, the urgency you once displayed. But this time nothing. You don't reach. You don't unravel. You don't shift into anxiety just because they've gone distant. You let the air remain still. You let the quiet sit between you, untouched by panic, that unnerves them more than confrontation ever could. Because suddenly they're no longer in the pilot seat, they're a passenger, and they're not sure where this ride leads. Your calm doesn't just confuse, it confronts. It holds up a mirror they didn't ask for. One that reflects your maturity back at them in contrast to the avoidance they've worn like armor. When you don't flinch, they're forced to feel. When you don't react, they're left with their own inner static. That's not a punishment. That's an awakening. A confrontation not through volume, but through presence. They might not admit it, but the quiet that once protected them now becomes unsettling. There's nothing more powerful than someone who doesn't need chaos to stand tall, who doesn't require validation to act with integrity. When you choose emotional regulation instead of reactivity, you dismantle the invisible dynamics they relied on, because what they counted on was your need, your pull, your emotional volatility. They expected to guide the interaction by doing less, but now that you're choosing stillness, they have no leverage left. The blueprint they followed no longer applies. Your internal discipline creates a new energy, one that can't be manipulated, baited, or dragged. It's unshakable. It doesn't chase. It doesn't argue. It doesn't plead. It anchors itself in clarity, not confusion. And when you operate from that place, their previous tools, distancing, stonewalling, disengaging, lose their edge. They don't spark the same responses. They don't draw the same emotional currency. They fizzle. Because you've withdrawn your investment from the dynamic they once controlled. It takes immense strength to pause instead of react, to ground yourself in moments that once triggered spirals. You're not just holding back a text or resisting a call. You're reclaiming your power, one breath at a time. You're proving to yourself that emotional storms no longer have access to your nervous system, that their inconsistency doesn't define your reality, that your sense of direction no longer depends on their attention, or absence of it. They don't know what to do with your balance, because their tactics never accounted for it. They built patterns around your responses. Now they're dealing with someone who responds with centeredness, not insecurity. You're no longer standing on emotional tiptoes, trying to earn closeness. You're firmly on the ground. And from there everything changes. You're unmovable, not stubborn, just self-possessed. You've stopped performing for approval. You've started honoring peace more than proximity. Watch what happens when you stay composed through provocations designed to shake you. Notice the shift when their silence meets your serenity. The discomfort they feel isn't about you withdrawing. It's about you not needing, not pleading, not performing. They can't place you anymore. You're no longer predictable, and predictability was their anchor. With that gone, the control they thought they had evaporates. Not loudly, but absolutely. When your center is intact, you don't need to match energy. You hold your own. You don't lower your frequency to be heard. You let your presence speak. Calmness becomes the disruption. Your restraint becomes the revolution. Because this isn't silence fueled by fear. This is stability powered by self-awareness. You're not walking away in bitterness. You're standing still in wisdom. You've graduated from reaction to regulation. They may try to pull you back in, subtly, with confusion, with guilt, with false openness. But now you recognize the difference between genuine vulnerability and strategic vulnerability. You know the difference between interest and influence, between connection and convenience. Because once you've felt the power of inner steadiness, it's hard to unfeel it. Once you've experienced how clarity feels in your chest, you never crave noise again. You've reprogrammed yourself, from seeking permission to owning presence, from reacting to responding. From interpreting silence as rejection to understanding it as information. Every time you remain grounded, you reinforce your growth. Every moment you choose stillness over spiraling, you step further into your authority. This isn't about winning. It's about becoming. Becoming the version of you who doesn't fold under emotional pressure, who doesn't confuse control with care, who sees through dynamics instead of getting stuck inside them. And that transformation doesn't just change you, it shifts the space around you. People who once controlled the temperature of the room with their detachment now find the climate neutral. You've removed the thermostat from their hands. You set the atmosphere now, and it's peaceful, intentional, present. You've stopped dancing to the beat of avoidance. You've created your own rhythm, one that doesn't skip when they withdraw, one that continues even if they pause. They may never say it aloud, but they notice. They feel the difference. They sense the absence of their old grip. And maybe, just maybe, they'll start to examine their own discomfort. Because calm is contagious. Presence challenges avoidance. Self-regulation invites reflection. And whether they step into that or not, isn't your burden. You're no longer adjusting to make others comfortable. You're staying steady to remain aligned. This grounded energy isn't passive. It's the most active choice you've ever made. To not be swayed, to not internalize their instability, to not mirror behavior that doesn't serve you. You don't demand, you don't beg, you embody. That's more magnetic than anything. That's where real influence lives, not in controlling outcomes, but in mastering your own space. So they'll wonder why you're not unraveling, why you're not spiraling, why you're not clinging. And the answer is simple, because you've reclaimed your regulation. Because your calm has become your compass, because their control depended on your emotional chaos. And now there's none left to feed off. You've starved the pattern. You've outgrown the loop. Not because you're cold, but because you're whole. You're whole. And that changes everything. Their usual approach, removal, unavailability, disengagement, begins to malfunction when it no longer causes internal collapse. Every inch they pull back loses its effect when you no longer interpret it as abandonment, but clarity. Emotional absence once echoed painfully. Now it confirms reality. That's what they never accounted for, that their withdrawal could become your teacher instead of your wound. They don't speak, but their behavior communicates volumes. It used to confuse you, kept you guessing, had you looping conversations in your mind, imagining reasons, hoping for soft returns. Now, you receive it plainly. Nothing hidden, no decoding necessary. Distance isn't a question anymore, it's an answer. Their stepping back doesn't invite reaction. It invites reflection, and you've done that. Thoroughly, time away from manipulation fosters perspective. Separation builds discernment. Once you sit through it long enough, the fog lifts. What once triggered panic now triggers awareness. You start seeing patterns not through desperation but detachment. Not cold, not numb, just awake. You don't need them to spell it out. Their retreat isn't a riddle, it's a pattern you've seen before. One that had power when you lacked grounding. But now, it just plays itself out like a tired rerun. They rely on emotional subtraction as a way to create pressure. That's their move, pulling away not to create healing, but to create hunger. Not out of reflection, but redirection. If they back up, maybe you'll move closer. If they disappear, maybe you'll overextend. But what happens when you stop chasing? When their quiet doesn't control the tempo, and your steps don't change just because theirs stopped. That's where you find equilibrium. That's where you become untouchable. You remain still, not because you're frozen, but because you're centered. There's a kind of strength in that stillness that shakes people who thought distance meant dominance. You've realized their silence is orchestrated, but yours is authentic. Theirs is reactionary. Yours is refined. Theirs hopes to manipulate. Yours is rooted. They assumed the silence would provoke a collapse. Instead it built composure. You transformed what they weaponized into something sacred. That's the shift that dismantles old dynamics. They don't have a blueprint for this version of you. They expect you to reach across the gap. But you don't. You acknowledge the void without resisting it. You sit in it without filling it. You allow things to end without forcing continuation. That scares them. Not because they want closeness, but because they want control. They need their tactics to work. Otherwise they must confront why they use them. Your quiet isn't about giving up. It's about letting go. There's a difference. You're no longer negotiating for bare minimums. You're not watering yourself down for fragments. You're not trying to build bridges from a place that only sends you messages when you've walked too far away. You've stopped making excuses for someone whose absence speaks louder than their presence ever did. You're not seeking closure anymore. You're offering it to yourself. that unsettles those who depend on unpredictability to maintain authority. They depend on your emotional instability to prop up their illusion of control. But you've found peace without performance. You no longer require chaos to feel connection. You don't mistake mixed signals for depth. You've rewritten every internal narrative that said love had to hurt, that silence meant mystery, that someone's detachment meant you should prove your worth louder. Now, you no longer speak just to fill voids. You communicate only when necessary, not when triggered. There's a vast difference between suppressing and mastering. You're not repressing expression. You're choosing precision. You know when energy deserves your attention and when it demands your withdrawal. Not out of pride, out of protection, not out of ego, out of alignment. They may test your resolve. Brief check-ins, sudden reappearances, vague gestures masked as concern. But you read it now. You don't get pulled back in by crumbs. You don't interpret vague outreach as growth. You've learned that someone who truly values connection doesn't dangle communication like a prize. They don't weaponize silence. They don't pull away hoping you'll suffer. They show up with consistency, with care, with honesty. You've realized emotional games don't deserve your presence. You've reclaimed that. You no longer break your own boundaries to maintain someone else's comfort. You don't cross your own lines to receive affection that's conditional. And the moment that becomes your truth, their usual strategy begins to collapse, not because you destroyed it, but because you no longer empower it. Distance doesn't bother you anymore, because you know that your peace can't be outsourced. Your worth can't be diminished by someone withholding their time. Your value isn't negotiable. It isn't determined by who stays or who vanishes. It's defined by how you treat yourself during the silence. You offer yourself the kindness they couldn't, the steadiness they lacked, the clarity they blurred. You become your own source, no longer needing someone to confirm what you already know, that you're enough, that you're growing, that you deserve reciprocal effort, not just occasional attention. You're not here to win anyone back. You're here to win yourself back. And nothing does that better than honoring the lessons that come from absence. Their pattern won't shift unless yours does. And you've done your part. You've stepped back, not because you're afraid, but because you finally see the game for what it is. You're not making noise in hopes they hear you. You're not standing by the door hoping they walk through it. You're inside tending to your own space, cleaning your own house, strengthening your own foundation. They feel that, even if they never admit it. They feel the strength in your absence. They sense the closure in your quiet. They expected pain. They didn't expect power. They thought silence would unravel you. They never imagined it would reveal you. They counted on emotional dependence. They didn't see self-sufficiency coming. That's where the mask falls. That's when their script fails. You're not holding grudges. You're holding boundaries. You're not building walls. You're creating filters. You're not punishing them. You're protecting your evolution. Not every absence is meant to be filled. Not every story deserves continuation. Some chapters must close, not with a bang, but with a breath taken in freedom, in grace, in quiet resolve. And in that space free from noise, away from power struggles, beyond the manipulative cycles, they have no more weapons. Their tactic has lost all influence. Because your silence. It's not empty, it's full of strength, full of clarity, full of everything they thought you lacked. They never expected you to walk away without pleading. That caught them off guard. Watching you shift from pursuit to preservation wasn't something they were ready to face. For so long your presence was a given. No matter how erratic their behavior became, they could always rely on your return. Your devotion, your energy, your loyalty, those were constants in their equation. But something changed. Not in them, in you. You saw through the pattern. What once held emotional weight began losing its gravity. Their disappearances became predictable. The breadcrumbs they dropped, once enough to keep you orbiting, now seem hollow. You're not bitter, you're not resentful. You're simply done subscribing to cycles that diminish you. What they mistook for love was attachment. What you mistook for connection was repetition. And when that realization hit, your entire posture transformed. Your attention had always been their comfort zone. As long as they had your focus, they could vanish and return whenever it suited them. Their inconsistencies were absorbed, forgiven, excused. But now you've stepped back. Not to punish but to reclaim. You stopped giving answers to questions they never asked aloud. You stopped explaining yourself to someone who never offered the same transparency. You're no longer available for chaos masked as intensity, and they notice instantly. Suddenly your absence isn't peace for them. It's discomfort. Without your emotional investment fueling the narrative, the script loses momentum. They try to maintain control through indirect means, sporadic contact, passive signals, reactive behaviors. But those gestures now fall flat. They're no longer met with your immediate reassurance. They're met with silence, not out of spite, but because you've elevated your standards. You've switched roles without even trying. Now they're analyzing, wondering, questioning. Where did the certainty go? Where did the emotional availability disappear to? What they thought was permanent has become distant, and that unsettles them more than confrontation ever could. Because it wasn't your words that held them, it was your willingness to show up again and again, even when they didn't. That willingness has dissolved. They sense the detachment and panic creeps in. Not chaos, the subtle kind. Internal, invisible, pervasive. They may not express it directly, but it shows. Their timing becomes erratic. Their communication style shifts. They begin reaching out, not from intention but insecurity. It's no longer about bonding. It's about restoring a dynamic that validated them. But now you're no longer participating in a loop that cost you your emotional well-being. You stop chasing, and for the first time they're forced to sit with the consequences of their own actions. You're not playing hard to get. You've become hard to ignore. They try to re-enter your world through familiarity. Old jokes, shared memories, sentimental cues. But the version of you they're addressing doesn't exist anymore. You've evolved beyond the responses they depended on. Once they realize their usual behavior no longer elicits a reaction, urgency sets in. They become inconsistent in new ways, reaching out sporadically, seeking validation without offering clarity. But you don't fall for uncertainty packaged as affection. You've grown accustomed to consistency, your own. That's what's changed. You now understand your emotional resources are not renewable in the presence of someone who drains without reciprocating. Where they once held influence, now there's vacancy, and they feel it. Not through confrontation, but through the indifference that replaces what used to be devotion. You don't beg for recognition anymore. You don't ask for attention. You simply continue building a life where peace becomes your compass. That's foreign to someone who lived in dysfunction and called it normal. They try harder, but harder doesn't mean healthier. More messages, sudden apologies, misplaced vulnerability. But everything they avoided before, accountability, consistency, clarity, still hasn't appeared. And that's all you needed to see. You don't need grand gestures. You needed growth. They never delivered that. Now you don't wait around hoping they will. Each time they reach and find no familiar response, they scramble. Internally, they may double down or retreat further. But now you're not decoding. You're observing. You've stopped translating mixed energy. You're no longer molding yourself to fit someone else's limitations. Your love doesn't come with conditions, but it's earned through mutual respect, not emotional chase. They scramble because their identity in your life has changed. They're no longer the center of your attention. They've become a side note in a story you're writing without them. And it's not malicious, it's necessary. Because you've tasted the freedom that comes from no longer outsourcing your worth to someone else's inconsistency. You've stopped making room for people who leave you starving in their absence and overfed on crumbs in their return. Your silence has become the answer they never thought they'd hear. Not because you've shut down, but because you've awakened. You now protect your joy like a sanctuary. You no longer explain your boundaries. They're enforced by your absence. They're felt, not spoken. And that absence, it's the very thing they once used. Only now it belongs to you, and that makes it powerful. They start thinking more than acting, doubting more than deciding. They analyze every past moment, trying to identify when the shift happened. They scroll through conversations, reading between lines that no longer hold your attention. They play moments in reverse, trying to find the point where they lost your access. But you've moved forward. Not because you're heartless, but because you're finally aligned. When you stop chasing, you stop bleeding for things that were never medicine. You stop pouring into cups that only had holes. You stop knocking on doors that only open to take, never to give. And when that becomes your truth, their rhythm falters. Their dynamic disintegrates. The role they played no longer has a stage. Because the audience, your attention is gone. They feel lost, not because you left, but because you no longer care. They're not used to that. They're used to control through subtle cues, ambiguity, withdrawal. But now they experience the other side of silence. Yours, and it holds no invitation. Only revelation. The game is over, not because someone won, but because you stopped playing. Without your chase, there's nothing left for them to mirror. Your energy was the fuel. Your consistency was the engine. And when you turned inward, their spotlight vanished. You no longer need approval wrapped in affection. You've learned to approve of yourself, even when others cannot understand your absence. Especially then. Their scramble continues. It may escalate. It may fade. But either way, you're no longer defined by it. You've chosen stability over the illusion of love, wholeness over fragments, truth over potential, and you did it the moment you realized letting go isn't loss, it's liberation.